All right, welcome everyone. Welcome again to today's Trojan Family Weekend webinar, 100 Days as Dean with Geoff Garrett, Dean of the USC Marshall School of Business, and Pedro Noguera, Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. You may submit any of your questions using the Q&A feature below, as we'll have a time to answer them towards the end of our discussion. In addition, closed captioning is available by clicking the caption icon also found at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, please note a recording of this webinar will be available after the event. Now, please welcome our moderator, Professor and Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Marshall, and former adjunct professor and EDD alumni of the Educational Leadership Program at Rossier, Dr. Sharani Little.
Thank you so much, Sujeen, and thank you so much, Kane, and the entire team for joining us today for this very exciting conversation with Dean Garrett and Dean Noguera. Thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to spend this next hour with you, getting to know a little bit more about each of the deans, their journeys as they've come to university leaders, and really their thoughts on what's been going on, not only here in the US and at USC, but really the globe. And so we look forward to a very thoughtful and engaging conversation. So thank you again, both Dean Noguera and Dean Garrett. And so let's start off with talking a little bit about this being 100 days, really commemorating your first 100 days here at the university. And Dean Garrett, I'll start with you. As you think about transitioning from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School of Business, share with us a little bit about how that transition has been and really how your first 100 days have been here at USC and at Marshall.
Well, thanks so much, Sharani, for your willingness to moderate this session. And it's fantastic that your personal experience joins both of our schools. And it's great to be on with my new friend, Pedro. We've spent a lot of time together in the last few months. Reflecting on 100 days is a fascinating thing this year, because I think normally we'd say university time is so much slower than corporate time. So 100 days would be just the beginning. But in the era of the pandemic, I think universities have been moving as quickly as the real world, maybe more quickly. So one reason I know Pedro so well is we interact in meetings multiple times a week. In a non-pandemic environment, we might have seen each other once a month. So that's a really big change. You asked in particular, Sharani, about my transition from the Wharton School. And I think, let me just say two things. The first one is that there's an enormous similarity between Wharton and Marshall, which really drew me to the Marshall School. And that is the fact that the business school at USC educates about 20% of USC undergraduates, similar proportion to Wharton at Penn. And at a personal level, I find that really important for the job because it makes the school more central to the university. But I think it's important institutionally too, as we think about the future of higher education and the role that pathways to professions are going to take. So that's the big similarity. The difference, of course, is the people. You know, you can understand, I think I have a reasonably good understanding of business education these days. For my sins, this is now my fourth business school deanship. But the thing that's unique about all institutions is the people. And if I have one regret about the last 100 days, it's that while I've had to be involved so much, as have you, as has Pedro, been in making critical decisions about the university, it's just been much harder for me to get to know people as people rather than as people serving in jobs. And that I think I just feel that mismatch between the incredible embeddedness that I already feel in the university from a decision-making standpoint, but the fact that I just don't know people. And of course, we all know it's so difficult to get to know people in a remote environment.
Yes, thank you so much, Dean Garrett. And I think that is a wonderful segue to you, Dean Noguera, because again, as Geoff indicated, really these first 100 years have been unlike any other. And the inability to really engage with people on various levels definitely can impact the way in which you transition into a new space, especially not coming necessarily from a traditional administrative background. You are a profound scholar and researcher, professor. So how has your transition been into your first deanship, unlike Dean Garrett, who has served in many other dean capacities, but bringing a different perspective as well as the wealth of knowledge from your experience in the classroom?
Thanks for the question, Sharani. And you slipped and said 100 years, and sometimes it feels like that. But
days, I'm sorry.
but it's been I've enjoyed it. It's been challenging, I will say. Some days sitting in front of the computer doing Zoom all day with little time to even get something to eat has certainly been a challenge. And like Geoff said, I think not being able to meet, interact with people in person has also been a challenge. I started to go into the office just in the last couple of weeks because I thought I don't want to get too used to working from home and forget that I have an office that I need to go to. And that's been good. At least it got me unpacked. I think, I really enjoyed being a professor, and I ran research centers, which had a lot of staff. So I was doing administration, but I previously shunned administration because I just thought all you did was meet all the time. And I'm much more interested in research and working directly with students. But I'm really appreciating the role. I'm appreciating being involved with my faculty and their work and being supportive of their work. And I like, to the degree that I can, working with our students and thinking ahead to the school and how we can have an impact in our field. So far, I would say that I'm enjoying it. There's a lot of multitasking involved, and I'm a cook. I like to cook, and so I like multitasking. So that part of the job is interesting. You can't let the rice burn while you're sauteing the vegetables, but and there are lots of ways in which that analogy works in the deanship. But so far, I do enjoy the challenge of the work.
Thank you so much. And kind of using the analogy of a rookie class with both you and Dean Garrett coming in together, to use a sports analogy. Dean Noguera and then Dean Garrett, if you can reply to both of you coming from outside institutions, as well as replacing very long tenured deans. So maybe speak a little bit about how that transition has been, and from a leadership perspective, what those in our audience might learn about some things to be aware of.
So I was very fortunate. The person who preceded me, Karen Gallagher, was there for 20 years, very long time. And she left the school in very solid shape. We're not faced with any major financial challenges. Our enrollment is high. And so I really thank her for that. I've also had the benefit of being able to get mentored by deans like Geoff Garrett and others who have been very approachable, very willing to help me in navigating the new role. So I feel fortunate there as well. And as Geoff said, we meet regularly with the provost and the president. So I feel like I have plenty of direct contact with the senior administration, and that's been helpful too.
So much, Geoff.
Yeah, so Sharani, even though Jim Ellis was only dean for half of Karen Gallagher's time, 10 years, he clearly left an indelible legacy on the Marshall School. And when I think about the great gift that is, it's the gift of momentum. It means that I and we don't have to invent anything from scratch. There's palpable energy and momentum about everything at the Marshall School. And the reason that's a luxury, I think, is that it allows me both the opportunity to think about building on stuff that's already happening in the school, but also having a little bit of time to think about new initiatives without worrying that would slow down the pace of the school. So I think that the key word for me is momentum, but that also it also does provide this latitude to think about new strategic directions. And I think we would all have been thinking about those things anyway, Pedro in his job, me and mine. But that's going to be even more important in the pandemic world. So we will get through the pandemic. But I think when we come out the other side, it's going to be a new normal, a different normal. And now's the time for us to be thinking about positioning our schools for that period and having coming to a school with such a great foundation just makes that much easier.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think, again, momentum is very important and really having a solid foundation, as you each said. But as we move and look back now on 2020, I think very little could have prepared education leaders for what universities have faced and really our globe has faced. And so I want to pivot a little bit to a lot of the challenges that directly impact the university. One being obviously the pandemic, which we'll come to in a few minutes. But I want to start with the social unrest and how it has not only influenced our social dynamic, our social discourse, but really universities and the ways in which students are experiencing the university. So Dean Noguera, I'll start with you. I know a lot of your research, a lot of the work that you've done around achievement gaps and really thinking about equity and race. Share a little bit with us about the importance of this time of social unrest and questioning systemic racism and the role of the university, please.
Yeah, I think one of there are many different aspects to that question. One is the kind of heightened awareness about issues of justice and inequity that we are all experiencing, and certainly our students and faculty are experiencing that too. And that's for me raised how do we support each other during this period when many people are stressed out, many people are even afraid of some of the election coming and what may happen. At the same time, continue to do our work, continue teaching. And we know that because of the heightened sensitivity, there are times when people are afraid of making mistakes and saying the wrong thing and how that'll be interpreted. So being supportive of our faculty, being supportive of students, I think has been really important. At the same time, I'm thinking outside of the university and thinking about what's going on around us. And just before leaving UCLA, I'd issued a report on the state of Black children in LA County, in which we documented the hardships, what we call the accumulation of disadvantage in certain communities. And that's where you really see the effects of historic structural racism so clearly, because you can't understand why some of these schools and communities are suffering so much unless you put it in a historical context. And just recently been thinking, because LA has so many resources, but also has so much inequality, and what can we do about it? And been thinking a lot about what role the university can play as a part of this community to address some of these long-standing issues and problems. And that represents, I think, both an opportunity, but certainly a challenge. But I do believe that there's a role we can play in making some real progress here in LA. And I do also think that if USC can do that, we'll be a leader for universities around the country.
Thank you so much. And Geoff, being a political scientist and building on what Dr. Noguera says, can you share with us, as a dean of a school of business and looking at a dean of education, what role can the university play, if any, in confronting and dismantling systemic racism and dealing with social inequities?
Yeah, and obviously enormous questions, Sharani, at a momentous time, I think it's fair to say, certainly in America's history. Can I just begin by underscoring a couple of things that Pedro said, because I think they're so important. The first one is, as leaders, I think we have to remember every day just how much stress everyone is under right now. If you just think about the pandemic is telling us that other people are dangerous. Just think about a profoundly anti-social awareness that we all have to live with at the moment. So we're being told we're such social beings, but we're being told that other people are dangerous. I think we should just never forget the psychological toll that's taking on all of us. Second, I commend Pedro for everything he's done at UCLA and now at USC with respect to understanding the accumulated consequences of systemic racism in terms of education. And obviously education is all about opportunity. It is the thing that can equalize society. So that's incredibly important. If you ask the question, is there a comparable role for business schools? I think the answer is yes. And let me give you two versions of that. One is that I think Marshall is, but can be more, and I know you've been an important player in this, engaged in the local community. You know, this morning I had the privilege to open a capstone event for our MBA students, where Marshall MBAs have been working with the California African American Museum on strategies for the museum once it can reopen post the pandemic. And you might think about that as a relatively narrow thing, but I don't think of it that way, because you know, not only is the museum literally on the university's doorstep on the other side of Exposition Boulevard, but understanding the history of Black people in LA, I think is just so profoundly important. Certainly for people like me who come from other countries. You know, if you look at this history in which LA, particularly as it became a manufacturing city, was really a magnet for the African American community and all of the culture that came with that, culture and dynamism. But then we have realities like the Watts riots in 1965 always to contend with, and remember that it was just on our doorstep. So I think having our students engaged in the local community is really important, maybe in consulting roles, but certainly with respect to entrepreneurship and small business. But in addition to that, I think we can, and I know you are a leader in this field, you know, we just have to take very seriously as a scholarly challenge to measure the impact of diversity in organizations on their performance. And I think we all agree now that diversity can be a great asset in organizations, but only if it's managed well. So I think for a business school, an area like recruiting, managing, and leading diversity is just going to have to become a core skill set for all of our graduates going forward. And so I do think, you know, you might historically think that business schools are a bit disconnected from social issues, but I think that's just not the case today. Not only because of the world we live in, but the kind of students we have. You know, there are a lot of stereotypes about younger people today, but the one that strikes me as being most important is that this generation is more mission driven and more purpose oriented than any generation in history. And that, frankly, that's an incredible opportunity for business schools, which are in the business of creating leaders, not only people who are going to have good jobs, but people who are going to change the world.
Thank you so much. And I think both of you really articulate a very important point about not only the role of the university internally and recognizing its mission of the external impact and not getting so insular about what's happening behind the walls, but thinking about the broader impact. And that leads me to another question about being interdisciplinary, and how, as Geoff, you were just indicating about rethinking business and its impact. And I think the pandemic has caused all industries and ways in which we think about higher education to think about the models and the models moving forward. And so, Dean Noguera, I'll ask you, as we have experienced the pandemic and are still experiencing it, what do you think has been the most profound impact on education? And connecting it to my last question, what might be some concerns about equity or inequities as a result?
Well, I think certainly it's the reliance on remote learning, just like we're doing for this this talk today. You know, that on the one hand, we can probably reach more people than we could have had we held this event in person, which is a good thing. I see over 200 people have signed up and are listening in, which is a great thing. However, we know that for students who need more support and who want to be part of the university, doing it from home is not the same. And I don't think we should pretend it is. Now, I will say this, Rossier has been offering many online courses for a long time. And so we have an advantage because we have students throughout the world who are able to participate in our programs because of online learning. But that's not, I think, a replacement for the campus experience. And I think coming out of the pandemic, we'll have to really find the right balance between what programs and courses do we continue to offer online, what's important about being on campus. We're raising the question now about, you know, should we expect our staff to be in the office and faculty, and should we share offices? And I certainly think that the informal conversations we have over lunch or in the halls are an important part of the university experience that I think we shouldn't lose. And we have to find a way to rebuild that and restore it hopefully in the near future.
Thank you so much. And Dean Garrett, in terms of leadership and really contemplating very different factors that you would ordinarily have to consider. In looking at, for example, immigration policies and visa policies, in addition to the isolation and the missing of, in many ways, the social gathering, what are some core issues or topics that, as a dean, you have to consider a little bit differently because of this pandemic?
Well, I think Pedro is absolutely right that the pandemic is causing us to question what's the value of an on-campus experience. And I think it's good to be under that pressure, but I don't think our answer is going to be, hey, we should move everything online because it's more convenient. I just don't think that's the way it's going to go. But I think we will be forced to ask the question, what is done better using technology versus face-to-face? And for me, I have a very simple, I hope not simplistic division there, which is that the stuff that is closer to lectures probably can be done very effectively in an online environment. And therefore, what we should focus on campus is much more interactive stuff, and understand that the magic happens in an applied environment, interactive, smaller groups, problem solving, shared understanding. And I think we already knew that, but I suspect the pandemic is going to underline that for us.
Thank you so much. Another issue that I just want to tease out, you mentioned as well, Dean Noguera, was mental health. And I think unlike ever before, leaders are really trying to grapple with this balance of addressing mental health and wellness of students, staff, and faculty, and achievement. And so I would love to get your thoughts from a leader's perspective on how each of the schools are addressing mental health.
This is, an issue I think it's just beginning to get the attention it needs and deserves, but we are going to be facing with long-term, I think, problems of a very serious nature related to the isolation. Humans don't do well in isolation. We've known that for a long time. I was talking to someone the other day who said their 12-year-old doesn't want to leave her room anymore. She's happy to just be in front of the computer, and she eats all her meals in the room and doesn't even think about going to see her friends or go outside because she's scared. And we've seen rising levels of anxiety, depression, and I think sadly of suicide. And these are, I think, major challenges that we will grapple with for years to come. And so whenever I have meetings with staff and with students, the first thing I do is check in and say, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Because I think it's important to acknowledge this is not normal, and that many people are under great pressure. I think about those who have small children, for example, who are trying to navigate their jobs or lessons while raising small kids at home. It's not easy, and I have great sympathy for people who are dealing with that.
Yeah, and could I just jump in directly, Sharani, because I think this is just so important. I would imagine that there are a lot of parents on this call of first-year students, and I think the transition to college this year is bound to have been harder than for any other year of first-year college students, in history. And we've just got to acknowledge that. That this is unprecedented. But I also think that mental health challenges were already pre-pandemic a massive feature of our world, and of our world in higher education, maybe of our world more generally. And I think you raised the right dichotomy, Sharani, or let's make it not a dichotomy between competition, ambition, achievement on the one hand, and well-being on the other hand. Clearly we want to maximize both of those, but it's not trivially easy to do it. Universities in the past several years obviously have put incredible attention on increasing formal mental health resources available to students, and USC has done that and done it commendably well. But I think the obligation we have as educational leaders is to sort of work backwards, not just deal with the symptoms of stress, but to figure out why the stress is there. There are some things that are hard for us to control, the sort of competitiveness and the comparability that comes from social media. But there are other things that maybe we can do a better job with. I'm radical about this, but probably not in an education, a school context, but I just wonder about grades. How do we think about grades? For example, do we think about grades as a kind of fear motivator for students, that if I don't work hard, I might get a C, versus something positively to motivate students where we say, if you work hard and you do well, everyone can get an A, in a context where we think about curves and the like. So when I think about mental health, yes, we have to think about the end of that process, the symptoms where our students are challenged. But I think we've got to work backwards and say, how can we keep very high standards in our educational programs at the same time as putting the mental health and the wellness of our students in central focus?
Thanks, Jeff. And you really raised some important points, really looking at the scrutiny of higher education that's been faced around, for example, access and affordability and inclusion, and this question of what are grades and what is the purpose or the value proposition of higher ed. So maybe if you could elaborate a little bit on how do you think the pandemic and everything we've just been talking about will impact the future of education?
Well, let me just say two things, Sharani, briefly. The first one we've already mentioned, which is that I think technology is now going to affect everything in higher education. In the past decade, we've thought about two different pathways, online, on campus. I think they're now going to be on a continuum. It's not going to be either or. There's going to be a continuum. One of our colleagues, Pedro, will probably remember that one of our artful dean colleagues, Willow Bay from the Annenberg School, said, don't talk about tech-enabled, talk about digitally infused education. And I thought that was a lovely concept because the digital is going to infuse everything that we do. So that's my first feeling. My second feeling is you've mentioned affordability and access a lot, and I think it's the right place to be, and we just have to be very aware that we must enhance the value proposition of higher education at the same time as we increase affordability. So, that's a difficult leadership challenge. Increasing access ultimately means leveling the financial playing field, which is a very expensive but a very important thing to do. But if you're on the other side and you think about the value proposition, I suspect increasingly we're going to be measured by the career opportunities that we generate for our students. And of course, business schools are in a good place to lead on that, because I think business schools have always been judged more than other parts of the university on how well our graduates do. And I just suspect that that's going to become an increasing focus in higher education. And I'm not arguing for a business school-led university or a professional school-led university, but I do think we have an obligation to demonstrate and deliver on the value proposition of our education. If we're going to ask and command the high prices that we do for our educational products, we've got to be able to deliver. And again, I think that's very good pressure for us to be under.
Thank you so much. And again, if I can have you, Dean Noguera, weigh in on that with just a different caveat as well, because I think vision and mission and values are shifting under this pandemic. And so even what students thought they were, achieving higher education for has shifted. So your thoughts about the importance of the future of education, what you think it's going to look like, and what will be the value proposition for higher ed?
Yeah, I think, I agree with a lot of what Jeff said. I think that the real challenge is going to be on places like USC to make sure that what we offer is so good that people are willing to pay for it. And that means the quality of instruction, that means the quality of support students receive. All of that has to continue. We have to continue to evaluate ourselves, what we're doing, and ask tough questions, because we can't afford to just assume that students will continue to come just because of our brand, our reputation. And so that's one of the first things I've initiated at Rossier, is a review of all of our programs, really asking questions about what we're doing, the quality of what we're providing. Going back to the question about grades, I've always put much more emphasis on the learning experience of our students. And I get trouble sometimes that we fixate on the grade And I often say, if I promise you an A, well, does that mean you're going to do all the reading? And to me, I'm much more interested in seeing growth. I'm interested in seeing students challenged. And I'm really concerned about how well we're preparing them for life beyond USC. So I think these are the questions we have to keep returning to. The danger is that we get lazy and that we rest on our laurels, and we can't afford that. Not in this environment, not at a time when things around us are changing so quickly. And I think there's a real risk that if you get lazy, that you'll pay some consequences for it.
Yeah, thank you so much. A lot of the decisions that you all make are really external and out of your control in the sense of the social dynamics. And I raised it a little bit earlier, but immigration policies, for example, and limitations to visas that have precluded many students from, even if they could, attend. And so I'm wondering how each of you, with your global vast experience, would weigh in on that impact possibly on the future of higher ed. So Dean Garrett, I'll start with you and then move to Dean Garrett.
We have lots of evidence that immigration has always been good for America. that because we've opened the doors to the world, that this country's benefited. It benefited in terms of the talented people in various fields, but so much of our economy is based on immigrant labor. When you think about our food, everything is based upon the availability of immigrants in this country. So I think that behooves us as a university to continue to play a role in making the university available to a broad range of students. We have, like Marshall, many global programs. And the students we attract are some of the top students in the world. And I think, so while it's important that we are a strong regional and national university, I think we should not limit ourselves there. I think that the great universities of the world will have a global reach. We will be doing things that address issues and challenges facing other parts of the globe. And that makes us stronger. It doesn't make us weaker. So navigating the politics that have become so difficult around immigration will be a challenge, but it's one that we have to take on.
And Shirani, just how personal this one is for me, because Pedro, I'm part of that migrant labor, right? I mean, I came to the United States for higher education and it changed my life. So I've been passionate ever since, both about the transformative power of elite American higher education, but also the importance of that education being as global as possible. And I agree with you, Pedro, about the fact that immigration has just been an enormous plus for the US. And the way I would describe it is that the secret sauce of America really has been the two-way connection between immigration and innovation. You look at Silicon Valley founders, all the studies show that more than 50% of the founders in Silicon Valley are first-generation migrants into the United States. It's not just migrant farm workers, it's people at the very top of the value chain. But you're also right, Pedro, that and you are asking this question, Shirani, about immigration policies. We're living in a world where a lot of things are beyond our control. So formal immigration policies are one example. A more local one right now is the fact that USC's operations are wholly contingent on the approval of the LA County Health Department. All right. So there are really important things that are beyond our control. In the case of being a global university, how do you do that in an environment in which I think we are deglobalizing? We're probably on the edge of a deglobalizing period. I think two things. One, we've got to do whatever we can to continue to attract the most talented, the most ambitious, the most promising students from all over the world. But equally, I think we've got to ensure that all of our students have really meaningful global opportunities themselves. I often reflect on the US with a kind of a plus and a minus to the fact that the US has been magnetic for people from all over the world since its founding. On the one hand, that's great, right? And it's really infused the United States, not only economically, but culturally as well. But on the other hand, I think it has meant that America has been able to be a more parochial country. Americans haven't had to worry so much about going to the world because the world has always come to them. I just think in the 21st century, it's not going to be that way. So we need to have a 1-2 punch where global education is concerned. On the one hand, we've got to keep attracting the best and brightest from all over the world. On the other hand, we really need to help our students become globally aware, because if they want to be leaders, they're going to be global leaders. And that really requires a sophisticated understanding of language, culture, history. And the only way you can do that is to get out there in the world. Now, we can't do that right now in the pandemic. And I'm really pleased at how we've created virtual international opportunities for our students. But I just think the importance of this two elements to a global education. One, we have a global student body, but two, we give global opportunities to all of our students. That's just going to become more important, even as it becomes more difficult in the years ahead.
Thank you both so much, because it really speaks to that core knowledge. And I think it speaks to our mission. What are we in our role as a university in this larger civic environment? So what you all have shared about working in our community, coupled with having a global perspective and understanding the role of immigration. I want to take a few questions from our audience, and then we'll, in a few minutes, get to some of my final questions. One that's really, really important, going back to mental health and wellness, is this notion of Zoom fatigue. And while we are seeing the importance of accessing classes, what are your thoughts, and how do you, at each of your respective schools, address that? Dean Noguera, I'll start with you.
I don't know if we have a solution to Zoom fatigue. I experience quite a bit of it myself. Sometimes by the end of the day, I stagger out of the office and it feels like I've been through it. Again, my hope is that when we are able to return to campus, we'll find a better balance. If we were meeting on campus, we would have had to build in time to get to the venue. We would have had some time before the venue to chat in person. We would have worked at a different pace. When you're doing everything through Zoom, you can literally schedule yourself back to back to back, and that's not healthy. We all need time for exercise. We need breaks. We need to eat. And so I am concerned about that. I'm concerned about for all of us. And so I think we will have a hybrid model probably in the spring, as what my expectation is. But I hope that model includes time for some interaction and some events on campus. That's what makes a university, I think, a special place.
Geoff.
Yeah, the two words that I think about all the time in this environment are flexibility and compassion. We just need to understand that everything we're doing is unprecedented, so we can't anticipate it, so we need to be flexible. And because everything is so uncertain and so hard to predict, we also need to be incredibly compassionate. But on the point of Zoom fatigue, I stick up my hand too, right? I'm exhausted at the end of a Zoom day. And I think it's not only because staring at a screen is tiring and we have no breaks, but also I now appreciate just how much energy I derive from being around other people. And you don't get that energy from being around other people on a screen. It's not the same thing. So how do we all deal with that? I know my personal solution, which I just commend to all of our students every time they ask me, is recharge. We can't keep sprinting day after day after day unless we recover. And I think we all recover in different ways, but we've got to monitor ourselves and know when our performance is really deteriorating and what it's going to take for us to switch off and recharge. We've got to do that. A long time ago, I said something to a business leader about being in universities. And I said to him, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And he immediately corrected me and said, no, that's not right. In the modern world, life is a series of sprints. And the only way you can keep sprinting well is to recover between them. And I just think that's so important. And it's being magnified in our Zoom world.
Very profound. And when we think about how do we operationalize that in the classroom, in our schools, advising faculty, staff, and especially our students. Another question really is looking at affordability again and really thinking about what can schools do specifically, or the institution as a whole, to make more equitable access to higher education.
Pedro, you're an expert. Do you want to talk systemically, and then I can talk a little bit about what we do?
So this is, a challenge, I think, for USC. It's one I thought a lot about before coming here, because I'd been at UCLA, a public university, which is already expensive for many people, USC much more so. I think we have a moral obligation to really consider which programs need to be subsidized with more scholarships. For example, if we want to be in the business of training teachers, we can't charge a teacher what we're going to charge an MBA. They're going to be saddled with debt that they won't pay off until they retire, if they do. And so we have to consider this. If we're going to train doctoral students, we've already realized we have to support them while they're in the doctoral program. So these questions, I think we have to keep coming back to. And there is, Geoff knows better than me that we have to consider what the marketplace will compensate our graduates later on when we think about our own costs. So it's a challenge because it's expensive to run a university, and now as a dean of a school, I have to think about those issues of how do we manage our costs. But we are not simply in the business of making money. We're in the business of educating people, and we have to strike the right balance.
It's very difficult often. Geoff?
Yeah, I think, it is difficult. And if I think, in the press, there's a lot of talk about the fact that higher education costs have gone up higher than almost anything else, even higher than healthcare costs in the US for the last 20 years. If I look at what has happened at Marshall, and certainly what I experienced at Wharton in the last several years, when I look at our cost increases, I see a lot of investment in student services, because an increasing portion of our education actually happens outside the classroom. And, I consider that a really good thing. I think experiential learning by doing, is so valuable, but it happens to be expensive. And so if we're going to continue to ask high prices because we have high costs, how do we level the financial playing field? So I think the simple answer, which USC certainly practices, is having high tuition but very high financial aid, which is disproportionately afforded to people at the lower end of the income distribution. Right, that's the right model. But I do think that the new challenge we have, which is now bigger in graduate schools than undergraduate, is student debt. And so I think universities have got to take on the question of student debt just as government does. And this is one thing where my Australian background, I just wish we could do what Australia can do. It's impossible because Australia is a small country and the federal government controls all the universities. But in Australia, students don't pay cash up front for degrees. They incur debt, but they repay the debt based on their post-graduation income. So if you become a teacher or a social worker, you'll be asked to repay your educational costs at a much slower rate than if you become an investment banker. And I'd love to work on strategies like that, similar to that are doable in the US, where we do it. We of course we want to ensure that students can afford to come in the first place, but we need to think about debt overhang. And if we can figure out a way to make debt repayment progressive, that is, you repay more faster the higher your post-graduation salary, I think that's got to become a new part of the solution. It can't just be financial aid to lower the sticker price of tuition.
Yes, it's so important. And as we know, Dr. Folt instituted some additional financial aid regulations to allow families, but we definitely know the quality of life impact and the quality of impact on the future of many of our students. And so it goes hand in hand, to me, back again to mental health and wellness, having experience paying for a higher education. One question around motivation. So in your first 100 days, as you've all looked around your schools, what are one or two things that have really excited you?
Pedro, please go first.
So, as I get acquainted with our programs and our faculty, we have several centers. I think we have 11 centers at Rossier, and many of you know, in fact, we have one center that Sean Hopper is the director of. He's our faculty, but the appointment crosses Marshall and Rossier, and he's doing extraordinary work throughout the country, and really, I think his profile has grown, as particularly at a time where so much more awareness of racial bias and racial racism in America. But we also have a center, and I think this is the center you were interested in, Sharoni, on organizational change and leadership, a program, doctoral program. And I spoke to some of the students last week, and I was just so impressed by the array of leaders that are in that program, who are in a variety of fields, in a variety of parts of the world. And it just gave me such a sense of pride that we're doing that at Rossier, that we don't limit ourselves to kind of a traditional approach to education, but really have expanded the reach and in ways that I find quite interesting. And so, and I will just share this, we're going to launch an initiative called the Democracy Project in the coming year, focused on how do we help teachers to prepare kids to understand what it means to be a citizen, and to understand their rights as citizens, understand Constitution, how to think critically, how to distinguish real news and facts from fake news so they're not as easily manipulated. I think this is critical, that we engage these kinds of bigger issues as well. And Rossier is well positioned, and we're going to draw on faculty from other parts of the university to work with us, because I think that as we all should be concerned about the direction our democracy is headed in this country.
That's fantastic. And I think it definitely will spill over to our own students as well, because I think, as you said, that's a global conversation around being civically engaged and understanding the importance of it in your own agency in that. So Geoff, something that has excited you at Marshall in your first 100 days?
Well, two things, Sharoni, that we have done, I think, that the school does really, really well. One, like Rossier, is just really high quality online education, which has meant that the pivot to an online semester is just much better than I think most institutions of higher education could ever aspire to. So that's really impressive. Second, I think Marshall has done a very good job with experiential learning. Again, it's challenged in a pandemic environment, but I think if you look, for example, at 50 years of entrepreneurship training in the business school at Marshall, that's longer than any other business school has been in the entrepreneurship business. If I think about foundations for the future, let me just riff on what Pedro said, because I do think leadership is going to be more important and more difficult in the years ahead than it's been in the past. And so I'd like us at Marshall, as you know, to think about what leadership in the 21st century means. One element of that, I think, has got to be recruiting, managing, and leading diverse teams. But think about the impact of technology on leadership. We don't want leaders necessarily who are geeks, but we also need leaders who can take advantage of technology and not be intimidated by it. So making technology a plus, not a minus for leadership, I think is incredibly important. And last, and a really big thing for me, business schools have thought ethics was important for a very long time. But if you think about after Enron or after the financial crisis, there was actually a pretty narrow definition of ethics, which was do the right thing. You're in an environment where you can take advantage of a customer or not. How do we ensure that you don't take advantage of the customer? And obviously that's incredibly important. But if I think about ethics today, it's so much broader. It's about the responsibility of business for climate change. It's about the responsibility of business where racism is concerned and other social issues. So I think that the challenges for leaders going forward are just going to be much harder than they were in the past. And business schools, at the end of the day, are in the leadership business. So I'm excited about the prospects of Marshall to really be in the vanguard of a 21st century version of leadership that's going to be much less heroic, much more humble, much more engaged, I think, than the vision that we would have had in the 20th century.
Thank you so much. And as we are nearing our time, I just have two final questions. First of all, as you now reflect on the past 100 days, what have you learned most about your own leadership? And give us a book recommendation for the audience. Dean Noguera?
Good questions. I think what I'm learning is the importance of being a good listener, and of there is so much I don't know about the role, so I've had to turn to the people who are around me, my associate deans and directors, and I'm fortunate to have really strong people, and I have to just recognize that I have a lot to learn and to be open to ongoing learning, and that has just been reinforced, and it's certainly helped me so far. With respect to a book recommendation, I'll recommend the book I've been reading by Isabel Wilkerson. A book called Cast. Isabel Wilkerson's a New York Times reporter and won several awards. And I think it's a great book for understanding the moment we're in with respect to racial inequality. I think she does a good job of putting in a context that many people can understand, and the reading, she's a great writer too, so I think you'll enjoy it.
So I like Cast too, but let me add a second book, a politics book, which is by a Vox journalist called Ezra Klein, and the book is Why We're Polarized. And the point that Ezra makes in that book is that for the first time, certainly in the past 50 or 60 years, divisions in the US are reinforcing, not cross-cutting. That's his point, that we had disagreements on issues, but they tended to go like this. Today, they go in the same direction and they're reinforcing. And for people who haven't read the book, I'll give you a tease, which is that Ezra says that if you ask somebody whether they shop at Whole Foods, you can predict almost everything about them from the answer, which is my interesting tease of the day. I do think the question of leadership, we've been talking about it abstractly, but obviously Pedro and I have to think about it in practice on a daily basis. And so if I reflect on my 3 months at Marshall, I think I thought too much about the business of the university and not enough about the people of the university. Probably because we were making big business decisions about how to execute the fall on a daily basis. But universities are people-centric organizations, and the people just come first. And so if we haven't had a chance to talk about this, Sharani, this week, but I had a really interesting conversation with a couple of our colleagues this week about the importance of feedback. And the fact that universities are just notoriously bad at the giving of feedback. So one thing that I'm going to try to encourage everybody in the school is to be in the business of giving feedback. And I think the way for leaders to support that is to acknowledge that feedback is a gift. So I want people to tell me how I'm doing, both positively and negatively, because it's going to make me a better leader. So if we can work on that this year and into the future, I'd be very pleased about that.
Thank you so much. And as we are wrapping up, I know that sounded like two questions, but this really is my final question. As we come to a close, any final thoughts, especially for parents and families and students who are continuing to be a little bit uncertain about not only this school year, but the spring and just, again, the future of higher education? Any final thoughts of encouragement to share with them, building upon your experiences here at USC, your first 100 days? I'll start with you, Geoff, and then with you, Dean Noguera.
Well, I think we should all be optimists. I don't know how you live any other way, but I think we have to be realistic optimists as well. And, even before the pandemic, I thought that uncertainty was the pervasive feature of our time. And if you want to think about dealing with it with uncertainty, I think at the end of the day, the most important thing we can do is just to understand, reinforce, cherish, and support our shared humanity. That's what we've got to do. We can't. No one can do anything on their own these days. We need lots of other people, and if we just remember that, I think we're going to be ahead of the game. With respect to the more focused issue of the spring, I think all the parents need to understand that we're just as desperate as everybody else to get back on campus, right? We're all in this together. But the university obviously has to think about the health and welfare of everyone at the university, faculty, students, as well as staff, and that we're under these constraints from public health authorities. You know, the pandemic's been a great lesson in federalism, US federalism, to me, about where does the authority lie. And the answer right now for USC is that the proximate authority is the County of Los Angeles. And right now, the County of Los Angeles says we can't be on campus even if we wanted to. We all expect and hope we're going to have a hybrid fall. It's not going to be a normal semester, but to go back to two words I used before, we'll try to practice as much flexibility and as much compassion as we can. We're all in it together.
Thank you so much, Geoff. Dean Noguera.
Yeah, I share Jeff's optimism. And in fact, I've been thinking about and you know, how can things be better after the pandemic, so that rather than simply returning to what we thought of as normal, use the pandemic, the disruption, as an opportunity to think about how things can be better and both, I think, at the university and our work, but I think in society. And you know, if anything, we've learned to go to Jeff's point about the polarization, that our divisions actually, not only do they add to the conflict and the stress, but they also prevent us from addressing our common problems. And we're faced with huge challenges. Just think about climate change and the impact the fires have had on us here in California. There's another hurricane hitting the southeast right now. As a society, as a world, we've got to address this. And we can't do it if we see each other as enemies. We've got to find ways to work together. I think education plays a critical role in helping us to see our commonalities and hopefully to recognize our common interest. So that's the kind of work I want to do. And I'm really glad to be at Rossier. I think it's a great place from which to do that work.
Well, thank you both. This truly has been an excellent class and leadership this past hour. I really appreciate you all sharing and really giving us this challenge and understanding and some insight into each of you, your humanity, your leadership, and really the reason why USC is really the outstanding university that it is in each of your schools. I appreciate having this honor, and I want to turn it back over to Sujeen and thank everyone for
joining.
Can
I just say, Shorty, you're excellent as an interviewer. If you ever decide you could just get another career as a broadcast journalist.
I think it's my education, both in the Marshall School of Business as well as the Rossier School of Education, and that is a plug for all of you all listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our moderator, Dr. Little, and Deans Garrett and Noguera for allowing us to peek behind the curtain, so to speak. So, as I mentioned earlier, the recording of today's event will be made available. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you for attending. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.